Well, this is kind of a tradition I do. Usually, when I'm gone from home for a long time, I end up accumulating a large backlog of orders, especially from Amazon.com, although not exclusively, mostly of books. And for a couple of reasons, this ended up being more of a backlog than normal. I was away much longer. I had more disposable income, and I just got more than the normal number of book references. So I feel like I'm getting in the position where I need to stop buying books and systematically try and go and read all of the ones that I have. But I've resolved that many times, only to not ever do it. Um, but eventually my liquidity will dry up, and I won't be able to buy so many. Um, but I like to kind of relay them because I think a lot of my subscribers would find some of these interesting. None of these books I've read yet, so I can't, say that recommend them. So if you're interested, check them out. These are
Largely, um, I got a lot of these books from two lectures. One of them is the most recent Gary North lecture that he gave at the Mises Institute. He recommended several books, and I purchased the majority of the ones that he recommended, although one or two of them are in multiple parts, and I didn't get all of them. Um, and the other is several books referenced in the 5-hour John Taylor Gatto interview that I made a video referencing, that I encourage people to watch. A couple people have watched it and told me that they found it well worthwhile. When I watched that video, as when I watched the Gary North video, I had Amazon.com open, and I was adding books. I was either buying them or at least adding them to my wish list. That's not exclusively what I have here, but that's two of the main focuses. So one that wasn't on either one is this book, The Not So Wild West: Property Rights on the Frontier. This is by Terry L. Anderson and Peter J. Hill. I've heard of this book a couple times. Oh, it's recommended by Hernando de Soto. I didn't realize that. Um, looks fairly small, so I'm glad. This is more like probably a collection of essays and not a big book that's going to take a ton of time. But I've heard about this book before. This is basically saying that the cliche of the Wild West, or gunslinging, homicidal, you know, uh, psychopathic, uh, Mad Max kind of dystopia is unwarranted. That is actually a pretty peaceful place relative to contemporary American society, uh, and with functioning property rights. So there's that, and another in a similar vein, The Invisible Hook by Peter T. Leeson, The Hidden Economics of Pirates. This is similar. This is an analysis of pirate society, how pirates are organized. Peter T. Leeson went to George Mason, and I first heard of him because Peter Betke kind of cited him as his star pupil. And he gave a good lecture at Fee. He's probably gave several good lectures at Fee. And one thing I will criticize the Mises Institute for, as much as I like the Mises Institute, is they kind of have a certain stable of speakers. They have Gary North and Salerno and Hop and Vegas. And a lot of people I admire, and I think it's worthwhile, but they do discriminate. There's certain people that they don't ever bring, and maybe it's because those people don't want to come, or maybe it's because the Mises Institute doesn't want them to come. I don't know. But Peter Leeson is one of those people. I think uh, you end up with a too narrow view of the anarcho-capitalist intellectual movement if you rely only on the Mises Institute. I think it's the main one. I think it's the best, but there's a clique around George Mason, and there's a whole lots of other people who can't really be assigned either one, and Peter Leeson's one of them. This book got a decent amount of publicity when it came out also. I haven't read any of his books before, but based on the lectures I've seen him give, I'm pretty impressed. Um, this was one recommended by Gatto, The Dangerous Classes of New York by Charles Loring Brace. This is very much in the vein of the Anglo-American establishment, I believe. Not having read it, this was published in 1872, so this is about somebody describing, a political elite in this relatively early formative stages in the United States, or at least the transformative stages. There's always been a political elite in the United States. That's who the founding fathers were. But that elite went through some major political shifts, cultural shifts, uh, at the end of the 19th century, and that shift is still dominating our politics today. And this is apparently a an analysis of that clique, or at least a major part of that. New York City is very prominent and very significant in this regard. So again, not a very big book, but my guess is this is going to be quite interesting. And this wasn't mentioned in the John Taylor Gatto interview, but it is by John Taylor Gatto, Dumbing Us Down. Very thin book, and I'm happy to say I have some other Gatto books, and they're also thin. Um, I like the thin books because it's like, okay, I can read this. It's not a huge commitment like, say, reading Human Action or Mad Economy and State. It's okay. 2 or 3 sittings, maybe even one sitting, depending on, it's got pretty big type. I mean, this would be a quick read. So no excuse not to get what he has to say here, I think. Not for you or for me. Okay, this was also referenced by him. Not, I think, that directly related, but it's by Moses Hess, The Revival of Israel, Rome and Jerusalem, The Last Nationalist Question. This is a book about Zionism before the foundation of the State of Israel, as in it was written before then, I believe. Let me check. Yeah. Uh, yeah, it was written in the 19th century sometime. Uh, Gatto recommended this. The author died in 1875, so it's before then. This was originally published in 1862. Okay, great. Uh, so this was, this is actually, Theodor Herzl is usually considered the modern father of Zionism, and it's apparently Moses Hess, who was a German socialist, came up with almost all the ideas just immediately prior to Herzl. So that's interesting. Well, Zionism is something everybody has heard about, but not many people study, and I include myself in that. I have not studied Zionism. Oh, and another book that he recommended, History of the United States of America during the Volume 1 by Henry Adams. This is a 9-volume work. You can find all 9 volumes. I didn't see anywhere where they were being offered as a set, except very, very expensively, but you can get individual volumes relatively cheaply. Gary North recommended this book. He basically lauded it as much as I think he could laud anything. Also, even though I consider myself a history buff, you asked me to talk about the first administration of Thomas Jefferson. Other than the Louisiana Purchase, I'm not sure I could tell you anything, and yet this entire book covers just during the first administration of Thomas Jefferson. So I think it's safe to assume that reading this book, even if it wasn't all that insightful or thought-provoking, would give you a lot of information about an important period of American history, more so than anyone you're likely to meet. But by every count, Henry Adams was an extremely astute and worthy historian, and that these are, according to North, and if I corroborated this to a slight degree on the Amazon reviews, these are considered basically high history. These are as good as it kind of gets. I didn't buy the whole set because I wanted to start with the first one, but if it's any good, I'll go through and do the rest. So, History of the United States by Henry Adams, who is, of course, the grandson or the great-grandson of, well, and he's the progeny of the Adams family, John Quincy Adams. Uh, okay, They talked about this in the Gatto interview. Gosh, this guy wrote Flags of Our Fathers. This is The Imperial Cruise by James Bradley, The Secret History of Empire and War. All right, this is about some kind of political meeting that took place on a ship in 1905 in the aftermath of the Franco-Japanese War that involved American and Japanese, and I'm going to guess, although I haven't read, British and Russian politicking. And there appears to have been some sort of, oh man, this is fairly mainstream, and it's got a high praise from the New York Times, from Stephen Ambrose, who's not my favorite historian. He's not really a historian, really. Um, so this is a mainstream book, more or less. The author is the author of Flags of Our Fathers, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the basis of the Clint Eastwood movie on the Battle of Iwo Jima, which is actually a really good movie. Um, this is, I believe, some kind of conspiracy theory, um, or some interesting insight into the political intrigues of empire in the Pacific, probably the ramifications for World War II, but I won't know until I read it. But Gatto highly recommended it. And of course, Gatto is an expert on students, so this seems less relevant to me now that have no desire to ever be a student again. But I may want to have kids, and I have subscribers who may care about this. So this is What Smart Students Know. Maximum Grades, Optimum Learning, Minimum Time by Adam Robinson. Uh, Gosh, he looks really nerdy on the back. There's a lot of indirectly pro unschooling, homeschooling kind of stuff, I believe, in this. And basically how the normal view of how to advance academically through schooling is just an artificial rat race. And if you really want to get ahead, you've got to do things a little bit differently than your teachers would say. So this is part of it. There'll be others. He recommended several. This one, conscious or conscientious? No, conscious capitalism. I'm sorry, terrible reader. Liberating the Heroic Spirit of Business by John Mackey, who is the CEO and co-founder of Whole Foods. I don't think the coloring is accidental here. We've got black and gold, and then green. So this is kind of like a left liberal anarcho-capitalist, which I got this book because he did an interview on Reason, and he said he's basically coming from the socialist bent, although once he got a business he realized he didn't know anything as a socialist. But this is basically his. If you believe in market economy, then you believe in mutual exchange anyway. But I think this is just an emphasis of that, and say, look, when two people agree, it's beneficial to both of them. It's not exploitation, despite the shrill rhetoric of so many. Um, yeah, high praise, blah blah blah. I thought I'd give it a look. Um, I don't know when though. Smart guy, successful businessman, good capitalist, worth looking at. Another Gatto book, Weapons of Mass Instruction, A Schoolteacher's Journey Through the Dark World of Compulsory Schooling by, of course, the one and the only John Taylor Gatto. This is I believe, his most recent book, or relatively recent, within the last 2 or 3 years. Again, not very long. I think this one is more detailing the specific history of where public or compulsory schooling comes from, but I don't know for sure. Looks good. I like that his books are relatively short. Makes it more likely that I'll read them. All right. Some of you know I'm kind of I'm starting kind of to read more books about Chinese history, so I made several purchases in that regard. And my method is to pick a certain focus on a certain period, because if you look at like China, you're talking about at least 4.5 to 5,000 years of history, not to mention kind of prehistory, with an awful lot closer to now, contemporary. And so kind of my strategy is to break it down. And with China, how I'm going to do that is I started with a biography in Chiang Kai-shek. I'm going to read some other books about the communists and the nationalists. I'm not going to read too many about the nationalists because they weren't in power all that long. And then pick each dynasty and read several books on that dynasty. And even though it's not necessarily the one that interested me the most, at least initially, although I think that may have changed, I decided to start with the last dynasty of China, the Qin. Maybe I'm saying that wrong. So here we have Autumn in the Heavenly Kingdom, China the West, and the epic story of the Taiping Civil War. This is by Stephen A. Platt. So the Qing dynasty is the last dynasty before nationalist republic communist China. And so I figured I'd read a couple books about that, and I'll have that pretty down pretty well, and then a couple books on the Ming, and just work my way back. And when it's all said and done, I'll probably have a pretty good basic understanding of Chinese history, which is a big gap in my knowledge right now. So this will help fill out that. This is part of the same. China marches west, the Qing conquest of Central Eurasia. This is a bit fatter. Um, oh gosh, there's a lot of text too. So, this and that together will give me a pretty good understanding of Qing Dynasty anyway, and hopefully a little bit of the Ming, and then when I study the Ming, I'll have a basic understanding. And then this won't be with the Ming, but Mao, the Unknown Story. And this is by Jung Chang and John Halliday. And John Halliday is an unrepentant Marxist. This, I believe, is an apologetic history of Mao, which is I find disgusting. But I will probably read it at some point just to see. This came recommended by a subscriber of mine, Ivan the Heathen, Guns and Violence, The English Experience, by Joyce Lee Malcolm. If I have subscribers in the UK, and I happen to know for a fact that I have quite a few in the UK, this book is all about the history of gun control and gun rights in the UK. The gun rights of America, the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, is something that is quintessentially an English right. It developed in the British Isles and was exported to America, and then became a much bigger deal here than it ever was there. But I believe this chronicles all that going up, and then the institution and implementation of very stringent gun laws and the effects that that's had. I've seen this author interviewed before, and I thought, it said Joyce Lee Malcolm, author of Guns and Violence. Sounded interesting. Ivan the Heathen, who very well read himself, said that it was a really good book, so I went ahead and purchased it. And if you're from the UK and you're interested in gun rights, it's probably a good place to start. I did a video on banks and politics in the Civil War, based on a great book of that same name, Banks and Politics, by a Federal Reserve secretary, actually, named Bray Hammond. Bray Hammond's has two books, that one and this one is actually by far the more famous and more acclaimed. It's called Banks and Politics in America, From the Revolution to the Civil War, by Bray Hammond again. I think this is more or less considered authoritative. I know Rothbard cites it as he does Banks and Politics in the Civil War. I love Banks and Politics in the Civil War. It was great. I don't know how he's going to cover a couple hundred more years with a book that's only slightly thicker. However, there was a lot that happened in the Civil War, so supposedly it's possible. It's the winner of the Pulitzer Prize. Prize. And Bray Hammond, 1886 to 1968. Was Assistant Secretary of the Board of Governors to the Federal Reserve System from 1944 to 1950. And so this is a good example of a book that's not by a libertarian. He's not against the Fed. He agrees with the Fed. He just has a lot. So you can't say that we're reading biased information here. This is from not an objective source, but someone from a different perspective. Um, and his biases come through in Banks and Politics. There are a couple times where he makes it explicit that the financial, the creation of the greenbacks and the Federal Reserve System, which in the Civil War they basically created a proto-Federal Reserve System, that of course that causes inflation and that causes a confiscatory effect where wealth is redistributed to the government, which of course is what libertarians always say, and that's bad. But his perspective is that's good because you want to have a powerful government, and it's not surprising from a guy he has high government, quasi-government office during World War II, somebody who's going to view the federal government as a powerful, positive social force. The things that we consider liabilities, they're going to see as pros, positive aspects. So this book is relatively expensive. This copy was $36, and it was a lot cheaper than any of the other ones. I used my Amazon points, so I got it for free, or 4 cents after shipping, something like that. But my understanding is this is an excellent book, so I will try and get to it. Now, this is a person who, if you're a serious libertarian, you probably run across his name a couple times. I have never seen him speak at the Mises Institute. He's someone who I think about as he's just not in their corral or what, but he's most famous for his work on democide, and that is Geoffrey Rogers Hummel. I think he helped in the Black Book of Communism, but he comes out with estimates of how many people have been killed by their own governments. But this book is Emancipating Slaves, Enslaving Freemen, A History of the American Civil War. This is basically, I believe, going to talk about how the Civil War basically, through the 13th Amendment, made everybody a subject to the federal government as opposed to an independent citizen. Um, Kind of juxtaposing that with supposed liberation of slaves. This is actually where even a lot of really liberal people kind of agree. The author of the book on Lincoln, critiquing Lincoln, kind of takes that view that blacks weren't really liberated. His view here will probably be, I don't want to speculate too much, so this is a tentative just forecast from what I can understand, that Civil War was not good for personal liberty. Um, and Hummel, I mean, I've bumped into his name so many times. I just can't believe I've never seen him give a speech or anything. And I think I've looked and I haven't seen it, but that's all right. He has books, so whatever. All right. This book was basically, I was demanded that I buy this book. It's a #1 New York Times bestseller. And GS Debunked, you'll be happy to know that it is Rich Dad, Poor Dad. This is not my typical fare, by Robert Kiyosaki. This is basically a book about how to make investments to have an income, more or less. GS Debunk tells me that it was this book that got him interested in economics and eventually made him into a libertarian. So that's interesting and that's good. And, it's a good idea to start financial planning as much as you can. So I don't make any claims to be a financial planner or somebody who has worthwhile advice in that regard. But maybe by reading books like this, I can put myself in a position that at the very least, I can uh, steer my own ship, so to speak. GS Debunked is convinced that this will help with it. Same line. Real Estate Riches: How to Become Rich Using Your Banker's Money by Dolph de Roos. Again, he demanded that I buy these books, and I couldn't say no to him for reasons I'd rather not say, or he'd rather not have me say either. This was recommended by Gary North. A Farewell to Alms. I've heard this book before. A Brief Economic History of the World by Gregory Clark. This is basically a book that talks about the significance of the Industrial Revolution and how it has radically changed the world, which was the point of Gary North's lecture. He gives like 2 lectures, and that's one of them. and uh, the outstanding quality of this last lecture is he recommended maybe 6 or 7 books. I didn't buy all of them, but nearly so. And this is one of them. This is a pretty famous book. The Next Blockbuster in Economics, the New York Times. Winner of the 2008 Gold Medal in Finance Investment Economics. Okay, it's probably worth reading. This book, I read the first chapter in PDF and was very, very impressed by it. It is a new book, just published a few months ago. The title is The Problem of Political Authority, An Examination of the Right to Coerce and the Duty to Obey by Michael Hummel. The introductory chapter was amazing. From what I could tell, it was the best argument for anarchism and against statism that I've ever really read. I mean, some of the Rothbard stuff. I've read others, some of the Higgs stuff. It's really, really, really good, and this stuff is just as good. And I correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this guy, he's just a professor of philosophy. He's not really a libertarian. He's just an academic who's just kind of looking at this honestly. He's got reviews here. Brian Kaplan has written a pretty nice thing on the back. I know Brian Kaplan's not everyone's favorite guy, but I like him enough. So this also was expensive. On Amazon, it was going for like $60. I found one used copy for $30, and unfortunately, the seller had no transaction history. Usually it says 20, 30,000, 100,000, with 99% rating, no transaction. So I sent him a message first. I said, "Are you even real? I'm interested, but I need to know that you're not fake." And he responded. He goes, "Just set up a new account." And I don't know if he got it here on time or not, but when I arrived home, it was here. So, Viva Capitalism. And I'm going to prioritize reading this book. If it's as good as I think it is, I'll probably do another review of it. But you can read the first chapter online. If you probably just look The Problem with Political Authority, first chapter PDF, you can read it, and I think you'll see what I'm talking about. Another John Taylor Gatto recommendation, Preparing for Power, America's Elite Boarding Schools by Peter W. Cookson and Caroline Hodges Purcell. This is about how the public schools are for plebs, that those who are going to be the voting public, and the workers go to public schools, and those who are going to rule, they don't go to public schools, they go to elite universities, a couple of them in particular. And this is just, acknowledging that fact and then talking about what those schools are like. Somebody has marked this up pretty bad. I got these used. I have no problem buying used books, by the way. If I can buy 20% more books because I buy them used, what does little few lines here and there really mean? If you know, sometimes you get little juicy little tidbits of someone else's life. What is taught, what is learned. Yeah, this is important stuff to understand what our tax farmers are learning. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, he recommended this, but I don't know if I'm ever going to do it. If someone thinks that there's some reason that this is really important, let me know. But this is The Cathedral and the Bazaar, Musings on Linux and Open Source by an Accidental Revolutionary by Eric C. Raymond. What a very concise title, by the way. I don't remember why he suggested this, but it was enough to convince me to spend $4.95 on, so after shipping. So the book itself was 96 cents. Okay, so I'm not sure how much I'm going to prioritize reading this book, but if anyone knows why it's any good, let me know, and maybe I'll reassess that. No, I'm not going to show that one. Oh, fuck. Ben will not like it if I don't. This is The Paleo Solution, The Original Human Diet by Rob Wolf. This is because I watched a Rob Wolf lecture, and I was interested enough to decide to buy his book, but I've already read Mark Sisson's book, so I don't know if I really need to read this one, but whatever. And let's see, China's Last Empire, The Great King. Obviously, this was signed in university at some point. It got this saved and used, and there's no book cover on it, but whatever. Nice photography. And last but not least, Bourgeoisie Dignity, Why Economics Can't Explain the Modern World by Deidre and McCloskey. This again was highly, highly recommended from Gary North. I think the two books that seemed like he gave the highest praise to were this and the Henry Adams History of the United States. This is about how the Industrial Revolution was this extremely important event and how there isn't really a definitive, convincing explanation of why it happened. And this is this author, Dieter McCloskey, who I believe was a man who got a sex change, but I'm not positive on that. It seemed to be implied by how Gary North was talking about it. That there aren't any convincing solutions as to why. You know, we say, well, it's the printing press. Well, the printing press has been around forever. Well, it's property rights. Well, property rights have been around since before that, and they're not as around. So what is it? Gary North thinks it's what he calls eschatology, which is the one word I learned from his lecture. Eschatology is how people view the future. His argument is that there was a religious movement, and I'm not a theologian, but I've heard of this term before. I didn't really know that much what it means. Hell's Unicorn, if he sees this and happens to watch this far, he probably knows a whole lot more about it than me. But the idea of post-millennialism, basically, people believe that the kingdom of God will be built on earth before the second coming, and that it will be paradise, which basically is to say, rather than thinking that we're all going to die horribly and all this bad stuff, Armageddon stuff will happen, good things will happen. Basically, post post-millennialists have a positive view of the future, and whereas many other Christians have a very negative view of the future. And if you have a positive view of the future, it makes more sense to save. And so, in a word, Gary North attributes, and he speculates, he doesn't say he can prove it. This is basically his hunch or his theory, is that eschatology is the reason there was an industrial revolution. He says he's contacted this author and expressed this idea to them, and that they're quote unquote in communication. But he had very high praise for this book, and I like North enough to respect his opinion in the matter. So this is kind of boring. I think I feel kind of monotone, but that's all right. There are a couple other ones. I bought some other things that were not book related. You never know when these will come in handy. Um, uh, this has nothing to do with books. This is a brush axe. It's for clearing away brush or zombie corpses. Uh, and then when I got home, I was able to go to a gun show, which was always good fun. So, all right, if anyone has any questions or comments about any of these books, let me know. If anyone's read any of them and can review them in more detail than I can, I'd love to hear it. But please don't give me any more recommendations unless you're really, really like amped. That book is awesome, because I'm swamped. I had to go and buy another bookcase. I have 6 bookcases now, and they're all full. Uh, so I'm getting swamped here. But whatever. I guess I can't complain too much about something like that. So all right, that's it.